All right. Hey, this is Will MacGyver. Welcome back. I wanted to pick up kind of off of what Nick and I talked about when it came to suffering. And really, there's a particular verse in Matthew chapter 10 that I often hear mentioned. Okay, so let's just jump in. So Matthew 10, it's a passage, obviously, but really it starts before Matthew 10. It starts in Matthew 9:35. Okay. And Jesus says in verse 35, it says, "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.'" So that kicks off the whole rest of chapter 10. And just a little background for Matthew. There's like 5 major discourses, and all that means is there's 5 sections that Matthew has intentionally set up that are the body of teaching that Jesus gives. So the Sermon on the Mount is the first one, Matthew 10 is the next one, Matthew 13, and then Matthew like 18, I think, something like that, and then Matthew 23, 24, and 25 are the 5th one, right? Just throw that out there. So we're in the second one right after the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 10, and it's the big second major discourse that Jesus gives on his instructions to disciples. So we'll get here, but the verse that I hear people quote most often in my community of believers is in verse 7. So if you want to look at that or listen to it, here we go. I'll read it. So in verse 10, 1 through 4, he basically he calls out his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits. So listen to that first. He starts with the 12 disciples. So that's context, right? We're thinking context. When is he saying this? Who's he saying it to? And he gave them authority over unclean. This is verse 1. Unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who's called Peter, and then the list goes on through the 12 disciples, right? So he's giving them authority. Then in verse 5 says, these 12 Jesus sent out. So clearly we hear what Jesus is doing with the 12, right? But we'll read from verse 5 to 7, but 7 and 8 is what I hear people quote all the time. But verse 5 says this, these 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans. See how specific that is to their context, right? Like nobody is saying that today, right? No one is trumpeting that verse, right? And saying, man, here's the commission from Jesus to go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans. No one's saying that, right? But verse 6, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Verse 7, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. And they stop halfway through verse 8. So that's the verse I hear people say all the time. I'll read again. Verse 7, and proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. And the reason it kind of irks me and bugs me a little bit is because people say it, and they kind of say it as if it is the ultimate thing believers are supposed to be about. That's like the pinnacle of Christianity for believers. And if you're not doing that, then you're not living out the fullness of what it means to be a Christian. That you've settled for less than a supernatural life or something like this, right? But I take issue with that, right? And mainly because they just look at the second half of verse 8, right? So I'm going to read it again. Verse 7, we'll start in 7. And proclaim as you go, saying, reminder, he's saying this to the 12, right? So before we can just jump and apply this to ourselves, we have to say, how are we making this apply to us when Jesus was saying it to the 12, right? We have to cross that theological river before we can figure that one out, right? But he says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. Rest of verse 8, you received without pain, give without pay. I don't hear that emphasized. Every person I've ever heard this is totally cool with receiving pay for spreading the gospel. They're totally cool with it, right? In fact, they might even call up an offering. So it bugs me that people emphasize one half of a verse and totally ignore the other, but not that they just do that, right? Because I could maybe like, I think just by human nature, we have to emphasize things. And because of it, we're not going to be able to emphasize everything all the time equally. The distribution, it should be emphasized, right? Like, we're going to do this imbalanced approach. And over time, hopefully we get a broad, balanced perspective. But it's when it's that closely tied and you neglect it so hard. I mean, like, you totally just abandon that half of the verse, right? But you're so dogmatic about the other part. Like, how can you do that logically? How can you do that consistently? It goes on, verse 9, acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or two tunics or sandals or a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. I mean, that sounds a little contradictory to, you received without pay, give without paying, but I don't want to get into those details right now. I just want to get, what is the major emphasis of this passage? What is Jesus really trying to emphasize? Is Jesus really trying to say, hey, with the pinnacle of Christianity, if you really want to be a follower, if you really want for me to look at you and say, yeah, that's right, you're doing it, that's everything I ever dreamed of, you better be cleansing lepers, you better be casting out demons, you better be raising the dead. And just to throw this out here, this is before Jesus. They go on this little mission, right? And the disciples go out. There's not one record of a disciple raising anybody from the dead before Jesus' resurrection. And there's only a couple in the rest of the New Testament. This is not like an everyday event, right? And just to spoil it, my opinion on this is Jesus is speaking not only to this mission that the 12 disciples are going to go on, but he's speaking broader than that. He has universal principles that he's saying to them that will apply throughout all time. But he's also speaking to their specific mission right here and there. Verse 11, and whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. So basically, find someone who wants to receive the gospel and wants to help you with it, and stay with that person. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. So all of a sudden, the emphasis is starting to come clear. Jesus is thinking about, hey, there might be places when you go to spread the gospel, when you're a laborer, right? Because Jesus just said, pray to the Lord of harvest to send out laborers. And now he's talking about what the laborers are going to do, right? What is a laborer going to be concerned with? What are going to be the challenges that the laborer face when he goes into the harvest? Well, he might have to find a place to stay, and they may not accept him. What do you do then? What do you do? He says, let your peace return to you. And if anyone, verse 14, will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Now, I don't want to go through every verse here. I'm going to skip ahead, but it's hard for me not to comment on this. The Jews, it was common for them when they left a Gentile town or Samaritan to almost like a purity thing. Like, I don't want to be tainted by that place. They would shake the dust off their shoes, right? Like, and that was a sign that they didn't want to be tainted by it. And now Jesus is highly offensive, saying, hey, you're going to Israelite towns, right? And if they don't accept me, they're just as bad as the Gentiles. I want you to shake off the dust off your sandals. That's a massive statement, right? We're not going to get into it. But once again, the point here is there's going to be places that don't accept you. Truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable in the day of judgment, this is verse 15, for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. So he's saying, hey, don't get offended by it. Don't worry about it. God understands, and they're going to get severe judgment. So you don't need to get all caught up in that mess of those who reject you. God's got it, and he's going to judge them very harshly. All right. Verse 16, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So once again, we get this idea in chapter 10, and we're thinking, what is the emphasis? Is the emphasis on how much Jesus wants us to be casting out demons, raising the dead, healing the sick? Which I think God does want us to do at some level. I don't know what the measure for each individual, or for some ministers more than others, because the gifts are distributed, unevenly, if you will. Or is there a different emphasis? So behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So once again, he's saying, hey, you're like sheep, and there are wolves out there when you go to spread the gospel. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men. Beware of men. That's what Jesus tells his laborers to go out. Like, hey, man, be watchful. There's dudes who are not going to want to accept you, and they're going to try to do you harm. For they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. So there's going to be persecution. That's what he says. Verse 18, you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake. Now, if this was just temporal to this mission that 12 went on at this time, this verse wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake. They weren't on that short mission They were not dragged. Even the mission when the 72 went out, which comes later, like in Luke 10 or something, they weren't dragged out before governors and kings, right? Those are Gentile rulers. That doesn't happen until way later in their lives. To bear witness before them in the Gentiles. Verse 19, when they deliver you over, so Jesus is speaking kind of into the future now, beyond this missionary trip they're going on, this practice trip, if you will. And he's envisioning that one of the major things they're going to confront is that people were going to be hostile and persecute them for this message. And he says 19, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say. For what you are to say will be given to you in that hour, right? So he's saying, hey, man, I'm going to be there. I'm going to help you out in the midst of this persecution. And there's so much more, but I'm just giving a very brief overview. Verse 20, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Verse 21, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. Once again, we're getting that theme of persecution and hostility for those who are spreading the gospel, even to the point of their closest familial relationships persecuting them and standing against them. That's what Jesus is warning them of. That's what he's saying to those who go labor in the harvest. That's his emphasis. That, hey, I want you to be prepared for the hostility that you're going to face, right? 22, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. It doesn't get much clearer than that. Jesus is letting his disciples know they're going to be hated. If you spread the gospel, if you're a laborer, you will be hated for my name's sake. But here's the key. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. So the emphasis, Jesus saying, I'm going to let you know there's going to be hostility and persecution, but I want you to be faithful to the end. I want you to endure. He's going to give them the information they need to know to help them be faithful till the end in this passage. And 23, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, this is a verse that gets talked about a ton, right? And it's all about timing, the eschaton, right? When Jesus comes back, what all the tribes of Israel, what does that mean? 70 AD, not 70 AD, future, still to come, blah, blah, blah. But besides that point and answering that question, which I think is a fun question to think about and answer, the point I'm getting is that Jesus is saying there's going to be persecution till the end. Persecution will be here till the end. So just keep moving from town to town as you will, because you're not going to get through all of them before I come back. Verse 24, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. Right? That's what we could do well with to remember, man, especially in America where everything's so smooth and easy for us. And we think like, yeah, this is the way. It's abundance, abundance, abundance. You know, I want to live in abundance, all this stuff. And Jesus says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. And in the context here, he's talking about being persecuted like him. He's saying, I'm going to be persecuted. You guys are going to be persecuted. And so he says, and that's in this age, right? If they have called the master of the house, he's speaking to himself, Jesus saying, if they've called me Beelzebul, right, Lord of the Flies, and this kind of like derogatory term about Satan, how much more will they malign those of his household? If they speak this evil about me, they're going to speak it about you. And no one's calling us Beelzebul today, right? No one's calling Christians like, oh, burn. No, they find what is the most insulting way to call a Christian today? Bigot, or you don't love people, or whatever. They find the way to malign us that is contemporary with our culture, right? Verse 26. And so Jesus says this, and he says, so have no fear of them. Have no fear, because the context is persecution and remaining faithful to Jesus throughout your time as a laborer or a minister, whatever you want to call it, missionary. For nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. And what I think Jesus is saying here is saying, hey, the way they've treated you, the mistreatment you've faced, he's like, it's all going to be made known. It's going to be justified. And then I saw it all, and there will be a price to pay for it. I'm not going to just forget about all the suffering you went through. I will remember it all, and it will come to light, and there will be justice. And then in verse 27, he says, what I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And verse 27, I believe, is saying, hey, I've told you things of what I'm like. I've explained the gospel to you, explained these things to you, what the kingdom's like. And now I want you, what we've shared in secret amongst us 12, I want you to go shout and proclaim to the nations, right? I want you to go get on the highest housetop to be able to reach the most amount of people, and I want you to proclaim it. And then 28, and do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. So here we are. We're still on that theme of persecution, hostility. And he says, do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So we get this reminder of who we should really fear. That in the midst of the hostility and persecution that will come our way as laborers, as Christians, as believers, as missionaries, as whatever you want to title it, he says, remember to not fear them and cower before them, because I am the only one, right? I'm the one who can throw your body and your soul into hell. They can't do that. They can touch your body, but they can't touch your soul. So he says, remember this. And then verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? So all of a sudden he shifts and he's going to remind us of how the Father cares for us, how he cares for us. And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father saying. So not one of you, the lesson is this, not one of you will die without me knowing. I'm there. I am watching. I care. I pay attention is what he's saying. Verse 30, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. That is so crazy. Like, that's literal. God really knows that. And it's supposed to be extreme, because none of us, no matter how much we love our child, we do not have the hairs of their head numbered. We do not have that with any person. We are not so just, I don't know, it's caring that extravagantly to care about every single hair on someone's head. We just don't, but the Father does. He says, fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Verse 32, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, so that's his reminder, acknowledge him before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. Verse 33, but whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. So it's this reminder of a positive and a negative. Like, oh my gosh, how amazing is that? If I acknowledge Jesus before men, lowly men who can just hurt my body, can't do anything to my soul, Jesus will acknowledge me before the Father. Unworthy me who sinned and screwed up so many times, that Jesus will acknowledge me if I acknowledge his greatness. That's ridiculous. That's not a fair deal. I'm getting like billions of dollars trading in garbage, you know, and then he goes, and the converse is also true, that if we deny him before men, Jesus will deny us before the Father. Nothing is more terrifying than that idea. And we need to think it. We need to chew on this. This is what Jesus says. Laborers who go into the harvest, they need to have thought about this, chewed on this. They need to count the cost and need to be prepared to go the distance. And he says in verse 34, as if we're going to get on some other theme, we're not. He says, do not think that I've come to bring priests to the earth. What? Jesus has not come to bring peace to the earth. In fact, he says, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come, verse 35, to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. It's so intense because those are supposed to be the closest relationships. It says, I'm going to divide families over this thing. Who will serve me and who will not serve me? I'm going to bring a sword and I'm going to divide those and find, even to that close of relationships, I'm going to come and find those who will follow me and those who won't. And it's not, even that tight relationship that's supposed to not be broken, it will break under this. Who will align with me and who will follow me to the end? And he demands that we choose him above our family, right? Verse 37, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So there's the promise of reward for that. For losing our life, we actually gain it. But look at that, verse 38 says, and whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. That would be a far better synopsis verse for this section than verse 7 and 8 about healing the sick, raising the dead, cleansing lepers, casting out demons. This should be the one that summarizes it, that Jesus is calling us to take up our cross and follow him. Right now, verse 40, we're just going to finish reading this. Whoever receives you receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. The one who receives a prophet because he's a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and the one who receives a righteous person because he's a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. So it's just talking about the reward that people are going to receive when they receive the message from these laborers who are going out. 42, and whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water because he's a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. So Jesus is going to care for those. So going on. So I've said this, but I'm going to say some things again. So I don't take issue with Matthew 10, 7 and 8 about healing the sick, cleansing lepers, casting out demons, raising the dead. Though We have very little record of the disciples doing any of this before Jesus' resurrection. We do have some record of it afterwards, and I think they did do it. And I think miracles still happen today. I still think there's healings and raising of the dead, but far less raising than people make it out there be. Because I think people think it's become popular to be like, man, I'm a super Christian if I raise somebody dead. So everybody wants to have that happen so they can get that status and privilege in their Christian communities of, whoa, you must be super close to God and spiritual because that happened. So I think people kind of wishfully think it does happen when maybe it doesn't happen. They exaggerate stories, though I think there's probably real stuff out there. What I take issue with is how intense they are about that first half of the verse and how they disregard most of the time. And maybe if I pressed them on station, we sat down and talked, they would agree with me on all this stuff. But when they go around and they're just preaching and talking and hanging out, they're mostly devoid, right, of that other stuff. They don't think about the persecution part. It's not the emphasis. They don't hear the emphasis that Christ is making in this passage. They're so trained in a certain vein of thinking that healings and all this stuff is the number one pinnacle of what it means to be a Christian, that they don't see that faithfulness and enduring and carrying your cross to the end is what Jesus is looking for. And Jesus assumes that other stuff will happen along the way. The healings, the casting out demons, cleansing lepers, like, yeah, that's going to happen. He assumes that that's going to happen, but he's not making a big speech about it here, right? He's making a speech about being faithful in the midst of persecution. So I want us to care about the entire context, right? I want us to say, hey, wait a minute, something's weird when we're only focusing on this. And once again, we're humans and we're limited and we have to focus, right, on little things at a time because we can't take in much. And I'm not even saying that persecution or hostility is the only thing we can glean from this passage. I think we can learn more, right? I think there's things we can learn that are implied or assumed, like I was saying. That's where I placed Matthew 10, 7 to 8. It's implied or assumed that those things are going to happen when the disciples go out. The question of how much that applies to every other believer is a question I think we need to ask, and I don't think it's just a slam dunk, because I don't hear a lot of times Paul is not telling the new believers he goes to, hey, you need to be doing outreach more. He says, live a peaceable and godly life, right? And if you disagree with me in the way I read that, I think it's very hard to disagree with what I just read because I was just kind of reading it, summarizing it. Go through it and read. What do you see the emphasis that Jesus is saying? Is it really talking about those things? Is the emphasis on what Jesus sees is valuable in Matthew 10? When you read all of Matthew 10, you ask, what is it Jesus wants from laborers out in the harvest? What is he looking for? What are they going to face that he says is the main challenges they're going to need to be ready and prepared for? Is it lack of casting out demons? Lack of healing people? Does he say, man, you guys, I really need you guys to get healing more? Or does he say, man, I want you to be ready for the persecution that's going to come to the closest, most sacred and special relationships in your life, and you need to be ready to choose me and endure to the end, take up your cross? Is that what he's talking about? So in summary, right, I think just to summarize up, what do we need? We need desperately to have a vision for this, to have the cross become central again to Christian lives, to bearing up our cross. In fact, one time, I hated that I heard this, but I heard this, and someone was saying like, hey, Jesus told them to take up their cross before he went to the cross, and now that he's taken up his cross, we don't have to carry a cross anymore. That is just so bad. Like, just please do not buy into that. Please reject that when you hear that. Love that person, but reject that teaching. That is bad teaching. You are absolutely supposed to carry up your cross. Jesus was envisioning the disciples, like we read, till he comes back, right? Till the Son of Man comes, enduring persecution and taking up the cross in the midst of that till that day he comes back. That was the context we just read, right? It's all there. You go back and read it. So, just to put it to rest, that's insanity to say that we're not supposed to take up our cross anymore because Jesus already did. Look at some of these other verses. 2 Timothy 3:12. It says, indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Acts 14:22. Strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. Through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. That's not even, look at this, 2 Corinthians 4:7-11. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted. Did you get that? Did you get that point? We have this treasure in jars of clay. We're fragile. Why are we fragile? Why does God let us bear persecution and be fragile and not just triumph over everyone and all of our enemies? To show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. It's in our frailty, receiving persecutions and sufferings, that we show that power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. We do not know this reality. I do not know this reality. And that's why I stare at these passages and I'm just like, what is this? This is so far from the Christianity I know. I don't know this Jesus. I don't know what this is to carry in my body the death of Jesus. And it's, if we're going to be laborers, if we're going to be carry the gospel like the apostles did, the disciples to the nations, we're going to carry in our bodies the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. It's almost as if you cannot get one without the other. We cannot be the aroma to Christ unless we are crushed. And through that crushing, his aroma is spread everywhere, right? Verse 11, for we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. 1 Thessalonians 3, 2-4. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's co-worker in the gospel of Christ, to establish and exhort you in your faith, that no one be moved by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are destined for this. For when we were with you, we kept telling you beforehand that we were to suffer affliction, just as it has come to pass, and just as you know. So they were prophesying, saying, guys, guess what's going to happen? We're going to suffer affliction. And then it does happen. No one says, hey, that's a bad prophecy. You shouldn't be prophesying that. They say, no, that's truth, and that's going to happen. And Jesus allows it to happen. That is a different paradigm than we have. 1 Peter 2, 20-21. But if, when you do good and suffer for it, there it is, suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing on the sight of God. Wait a minute. What you're telling me, if I endure suffering, it's a gracious thing on the side of God? For to this you have been called. You've been called to do this because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. So Christ left us an example in his suffering that we're to follow out. For reals. And these guys all really did walk out suffering, right? Peter did, Paul did, right? They lived it out. They died as martyrs. The New Testament frequently speaks of believers needing to endure suffering, to share in suffering, to be united with Christ through suffering. And I just want us to start saying, yeah, yep, that's true. I need to get a paradigm that's not shaped by my Western comfort and the American dream, right? But I need to get a paradigm of the gospel and what it means to follow Jesus that's shaped by the New Testament, that's shaped by what those words say, that's shaped by Matthew 10. So